There you are, playing the PvP in your World War II shooter, and all of a sudden, you're a Nazi.
Well, isn't that a great way to start off your video and to start off this one? Hello, Nazi boys and girls. This is your pal Nazi Guy 1488 here, who used to be known as Something Guy 912 until I played Call of Duty World at War that one time and instantly drew sentiments with the Nationalist Socialist Party of Germany because, as we all well know, violent video games can make you commit shooting sprees, make you hate women, and be a Nazi. Extra Credits hasn't had a particularly good track record of consistency, especially if you go through their backlog of videos where they opine on one hand and editorialize on another, and this video in particular just absolutely reeks of the "anyone I don't like is a Nazi" meme that has plagued modern conversation since Trump won the 2016 election. Not to say that that was the bedrock of character assassination, seeing that this video is going to be using a lot of the same fundamental arguments both Aeneas Sarkeesian, Jack Thompson, and Ben Shapiro have made about how media can subtly influence you, resulting in the simple base idea that video games causes X. While I've already defeated this absurd point of argumentation, video games causing one to be a Nazi is definitely a hell of a stretch that I'm sure EC are well prepared to misrepresent in order to fit the billing.
You didn't ask for this. You didn't choose this. Yet there it is.
I mean, where exactly do I begin? Do I start with the fact that he's basically taken away any player agency in playing a World War II multiplayer shooter where you might have to play as the Axis powers? Or the part where he thinks being routed to a server where there is a fundamental imbalance and that putting you on the Axis powers to curb that balance is somehow bad? Not that Battlefield 5 is a particularly good demonstration to even make your argument, seeing as they are beyond afraid of even being historically accurate, lest they offend the likes of you, who might glance a swastika now and again, but go on.
And it's treated no differently than playing a British soldier.
Are you insisting that the players who play the Nazis should be given an inherent disadvantage to the other team? Or do you want the game to basically nanny you about how evil you are? Where do you draw the line? Would you prefer more retroactive changes to history to the point that the Allies are fighting the Allies? I mean, sure, let's completely ignore the very concept of team balance or the idea of moral relativism. Nazis are bad, and you should feel bad even if it's in the spirit of a fictional world.
This is bad on so many levels.
I'm going to give you a big fat no to that even before you preface it, since you're already making a bad argument as it is.
No one should ever have a random chance of fighting for the Nazis.
I mean, if we're talking about in a general sense, yes. Like, yeah, it would be completely out of place if I queued up for a match on Team Fortress 2 and I got put on the Nazi team, but in World War II, that seems completely par for the course as they were a major faction of the war. None of your moral outrage against them is going to change the fact that they were the reason the war even happened to begin with. And more importantly, it's a fucking video game, not a identification card that you spin the wheel and might get unlucky with pulling certified Nazi.
And we should never express that there's no meaningful difference between Nazis and Allied soldiers, or that they're functionally interchangeable.
So you are basically calling for Nazis to be nerfed, so that if you play as the Allies, you're basically going to win every time? And sorry to burst your bubble, sweetie, but the Nazis were more technologically advanced against the Allies. The only two main reasons the Nazis lost was that Hitler was more charismatic than brains or tactics, and that he thought he could piss off the Americans without them intervening as he was winning. The only reason that's not functionally demonstrated in any wartime game is for balance's sake. More importantly, when the Allies did defeat Hitler and the Nazis, guess what? They borrowed their tech. They learned from their enemy. So guess what, Snowflake? You're a Nazi by that association.
And before anyone equivocates and says not all German soldiers in World War II were Nazis.
Because that's the likely defense most people would make, and not that you are literally labeling anyone who happens to play as the Nazis in a first-person shooter game as one. More like, before anyone calls me out on my bullshit and says I'm about to shift the goalpost tactic here.
If they were wearing the swastika and are functioning as an arm of the Nazi government, then unless the game goes out of its way to tell you specifically that your particular character is not a Nazi, then they're a Nazi.
Ah, so that's how that works, right? Guilt by association? So when Hindus have used the swastika as a blessing for thousands of years before the Nazis appropriated it by using EC's retroactive lens, they're Nazis too, right? Or Better yet, if EC have ever used the Nazi logo in a video to demonstrate something, if they haven't specifically stated that they aren't Nazis, they are Nazis? Also, why do I need the game to tell me if I'm a Nazi or not when I should be able to deduce that for myself? Do you think the player base so small that they wouldn't be able to dissociate themselves from the player character who doesn't really have a stake in the politics of the war and rather just the conflict itself?
In that multiplayer shooter, when it switched you to the German side, did it go out of its way to tell you that the person you're playing was pressed into service under threat of their life? Yeah, that's a big ol' nope.
Don't smear TF2 memes with your drivel. And again, why would I need that bit of backstory? I can assess for myself that I'm not a Nazi even as I'm playing one. I could see the necessity for something like this being essential in a single-player campaign where you are playing a character with built-in lore, but as me and the grinder, it's a moot point. It's asinine to even insist the game needs to remind you that, like you're a child who can't discern fantasy from reality.
Oh, and on a similar note, let's please stop forcing people to play as terrorists as well.
Well, hey, why stop there? Let's stop forcing people to play as the Empire in any Battlefront game because they're the bad guys. Stop forcing kids to play as the robbers and cops and robbers, or else they might actually think they are robbers, right? Weird how the popularity of Payday 2 has no correlation with the number of bank robbings whatsoever. Really activates those almonds, huh?
There you are, playing your modern shooter, and all of a sudden you're a terrorist. You didn't ask for this, you didn't choose this, and yet second verse same as the first. There it is.
Nice lazy editing there, EC. Literally ad-libbed the same line from the beginning while using the same exact animation cutouts from 9 years ago. But yeah, reinforcing the same dumb point doesn't convince me anymore to the idea that I can't disassociate a game from reality. I highly doubt real-life terrorists use CSGO as their fucking training manual.
I mean, that's literally the name of your side in the game.
The game you happen not to mention because you want to make a general point, even though Counter-Strike is the only game series I can think of in my head that makes the team names like that. Also, EC, let me humor you for a moment. Let's say I grew up hating the color red, just absolutely loathe it, like Nazis, and I play TF2. Would you say it would be fair of me to pontificate about how Team Fortress 2 forces you to play the red team? I mean, it's in the name, and I hate red, so of course it's a sensible point by your metric, but you wouldn't actually say that it is.
We can do better than this.
By removing any traces of wartime shooters to real-life struggles and conflicts. In fact, I'm offended that the Viet Cong are represented as a team in Black Ops 1, so we must remove that despite it being set within the period and they being a huge faction in the Vietnam War. Or, better yet, remove the fucking Vietnam War in general because the Americans were also bad in that too. I only want Team Sparkles and Rainbows as the acceptable team names, even if we are slaughtering each other with heavy firearms, because as we all know, words hurt more than quick dry cement milkshakes and metal pipes to the face.
Even if you put aside all of the people who have had traumatic experiences with these groups, who have lost loved ones to terrorists, or who have had generations of their families wiped out by Nazis,
it's pretty easy to put aside because the games don't paint a bright picture of the Nazis or really any group in their games. They're not fucking documentaries, you dollop, but more to the point, those people who feel traumatized, despite you saying they didn't make the choice, chose likely not to play these games because it might very well hit too close to home or relive some PTSD moments. You moralizing about it, like as if you could even imagine what they go through, yet try to funnel it out of them for brownie points like the leech you are, won't guilt trip me or distract me against your argument that by me playing as the Nazis and I'm somehow am one, or that I'm somehow emboldening them by having them exist as an entity. Also, what if these people have played as the Nazis in these games and can easily disassociate the difference? What say you then? That people who lost generations of people to family members by Nazis are emboldening Nazis through playing them in the fucking video game? I would love to see the way your mind would juggle that tub of doublethink.
no one should have to put on the costume of an ideology they find abhorrent.
For fuck's sake, dude, you're treating this like as if people are playing World War II games blindly and getting the fucking yellow star stapled to their forehead by surprise. If people are really that bothered that a game set in World War II depicts Nazis, and believe me, there are people like that, then guess what? They don't have to play the game. It's not the fucking game's fault for accurately depicting a major heel of one of the largest worldwide conflicts known in history. It's limp dick pussies like you who think words are violence and violence are words. You know what costume you can put on? A clown costume, you joke of a video game education channel.
Without actually opting into it in your game.
And you know what would happen if they could opt in EC? Everyone would just go to the Nazis just to troll and spite you after watching your wretched abomination of a video. Don't believe me? People literally troll the media into thinking that the OK hand symbol was a form of white supremacy. That's how much people don't give a shit about what you find offensive. More importantly, it would cause extreme team imbalance in the game, and swabs of reviews shitting on there being no imbalance would come aplenty. You know, for a channel that apparently prides itself on explaining the mechanics and designs on video games, seems completely baffled by this concept alone.
And by making people do so, we get them to stop thinking about it.
So again, I say before that you basically want the game to browbeat the player about how bad the Nazis were, like as if that wasn't a big fucking surprise. Also, you're doing this under the assumption that the people playing these games aren't already aware of it, like as if middle school and high school constantly remind you of it. But I think this also goes into this noticeable trend of games becoming more fixated on the political rather than the functional. That a game needs to be political first and damn the rest, even when it doesn't make sense in the context of the world it's in, like with Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 and the inclusion of a character named Ruby who's a transgender gay Muslim fighting against the oppression of modern society, Exhibit A. My thoughts aside about VTM beyond that, it's like as if the people behind these games think they need to browbeat their audience before giving them a pleasant experience, or at least have the politics wedged in neatly with the game itself. I'm not convinced that EC would anyway want browbeating Nazis a mechanic that feels neatly juxtaposed with the gameplay at all. In fact, I'm convinced he wants it put to the disservice of making the gameplay solid to begin with.
To stop thinking of the meaning behind these things. We normalize them.
Honk honk, red alert, Clown World at LaughCon 1. I mean, this is basically the angle Aeneas Sarkeesian was making about how we normalize prostitutes in video games or sexuality as a whole, right? That by noting their very existence, we somehow make it seem like it's immediately okay. I guess that's why legacy media wants to wipe Alex Jones from existence, because to even speak of him is to wish ill on yourself, I presume.
We make them just window dressing for entertainment.
Well, boy, do I have a shocker for you. Video games are, hold my breath here, entertainment! You're quite literally going through a window of history vicariously through the controller and console. I know, who would have funked that? I guess all those hours I sat watching history documentaries with my dad about World War II were actually just them normalizing the concept of Nazis, am I right? Or better yet, history channels on YouTube talking about Nazis basically means that you, extra credits, are Nazis, even if YouTube shuts down those channels or demonetizes them. What wonderful irony.
Those uniforms, those symbols, become things that no longer inherently revolt us.
Oh, I'm sure they do, considering how often video games makes the Nazis the bad guys, like with Wolfenstein or Call of Duty, for example. I mean, COD Zombies literally has you fighting through waves and waves of Nazi zombies in almost every iteration of that series. And guess what? That doesn't also make a actual Nazi any less deterred about their ideology because of it. Moreover, does that mean that said actual Nazi is allowed to get offended about playing the Allies in Battlefield 5 because it normalizes them to him? If we're going to be totally consistent about this, which you won't.
They reduce our visceral reaction to seeing the embodiment of these ideologies.
That's still a comically absurd point to make. Like as if playing the terrorists in CSGO makes me any less hateful of them as a group when they do the bombing runs. It's almost like you can point out that disassociation wearing games aren't reality, but you equate it to people being desensitized by reality through the medium. There's absolutely no reason a millennial like you or me should be reeling at events that have almost no impact on us, especially when they are depicted in a format like this. Does reading Mein Kampf or watching Triumph of the Will somehow erase the outright evil things that the Nazis do because it makes their side nearly sympathetic? You know goddamn well it doesn't.
Now, does this make us totally ignore the history that comes with them? No.
Well, at least you were able to concede on just one point rather than go full literally Hitler on us.
But for some people, It moves them from the territory of revolting to just edgy. It makes scrawling a swastika on something change from unthinkable to just dangerous.
Man, you really have never seen Hindus or Indian people in general deface their cars or any valuable property with that swastika. For a guy who seems so intent on reminding us about history, has conveniently forgotten that the swastika has existed long before 1929. More importantly, it's edgy because spamming it nonstop takes away any power it might have, so to repeat myself, only trying to censor it will only become further validated.
It means you might not take iron crosses all over a website as a warning sign that you should immediately leave.
Wait, I thought the whole knee jerk was about the swastika, and now you're just complaining about the iron cross when you've displayed it in your videos prominently up to that point? Also, it makes even less sense to suspect the iron cross of all things as a hate symbol, considering that it was only a badge of honor for wartime and not a staple like the swastika, and that the German military reconstituted the Iron Cross in regards to banning of the swastika. The only versions of the Iron Cross that got banned were the ones that specifically had the swastika emblazoned on the center of it. And if that's what he's getting at, okay, but he hasn't demonstrated that through the visual medium, as he's just copy-pasted the Iron Cross like as if that would be an immediate distinction of Nazi when it clearly isn't.
And if you don't leave, you might start reading and buying into hateful ideas there.
Burn the books, says Extra Credits. Never mind the fact that Nazis did the exact same thing under the guise that some books might push bad ideas, and that said people who bought into those bad ideas already had those intentions to begin with. Get rid of those channels who talk about the Nazis so we can learn not to repeat those same justifications. In fact, if we're going to go all clean slate about, why don't we start with your channel? Because all that Iron Cross imagery is getting me into the spirit of killing some Jews for some insurmountable reason.
It seems like such a small and simple thing, but it's things like this that erode our safeguards against dangers we sacrifice so much to fight.
Now, I know what you're thinking. Extra Credits, isn't this just a stupid hill to die on that we basically become the very thing we fought against? But actually, I'm still right. See this grave that I'm digging for myself? Well, if I keep digging deeper, it'll eventually amount to something.
By the time you've played 100 hours of being a Nazi, their voice stabs become memes and in-jokes with your friends.
With emphasis on the in-joke, meaning that you and the friend are well aware that you aren't serious about it in the slightest. And yeah, 1488, Clown World, Pepe, and the OK hand symbol are funny because it takes fuckers like you to reveal their full context when most won't care in the slightest. I would dare say the biggest fans of those memes are the ones who get perpetually offended by them because they are the ones who give them real power.
By the 1000th time you've respawned as a terrorist, you're either celebrating them or making fun of them.
I wonder if EC seriously went through the process of figuring out exactly at what point you would celebrate or make fun of the terrorists, which, if I don't add, sounds like something you would do naturally in any game of CSGO from the moment you stepped in. I mean, it could have been 999 times you made fun or celebrated them, 1,101 times, or 47,271 times for all we know. All I'm saying is that either EC doesn't have any basis to say this with as much confidence as he does, or he has, and by that metric, he's normalized terrorism. Caught in the spider's web you spun there, pal.
Neither of which helps the global crisis we have that takes thousands of lives every year.
Hey, guess what, Mr. Moral Panic? Making videos like this gaslighting anyone enjoying their free time doesn't help the terrorist situation either. Is this your opportunity to tell us how to live our lives and that you somehow live yours fruitfully? Are you Jordan Peterson? Go outside and shoot some terrorists, bucko!
So what do?
We kill the Batman.
That's easy. Don't make them morally equivalent.
To say that Battlefield 5 or World at War somehow makes them moral equivalents rather than make them morally absent is absurd. Not to mention that by Extra Credits' own basis, that won't be enough for him. Remember, he wants to make it blatantly known to the player that he's super bad, browbeat them to change teams so no one ever has to play the Nazis. Oh yeah, and I'm sure that the Allies weren't just unambiguously good either. America was mostly for Nazi Germany so long as they didn't be evolved. Russia wanted to finish the job, as it were, of concentration camps, and in spite of the millions of Jews that the Nazis killed, they had made technological marvels that we have adopted to this very day. So nonsense with this idea that the Nazis are just your Saturday morning cartoon villain.
Don't make there be no in-game moral difference between your Nazis and your allies, between your terrorists and your counter-terrorist squads.
You know, normally whenever someone gets knee-jerk about the idea of calling everyone a Nazi, I predictably think of the loony leftists who think calling everyone a fascist wins them arguments. But seeing as EC is also knee-jerk about there being no moral equivalence to terrorists, something people on the left also seem to have a multitude of excuses at the ready for, it's not that easy. Nonetheless, I am no different against the idea that we should have to remind people that terrorists are bad guys, same goes for Nazis. If you want to be reminded about how bad terrorism is, watch the news. Video games are not an accurate source for your history dialectic, especially with Battlefield 5.
Frame PvP as a training exercise, or simply take one of your non-odious sides and recolor them so that it's red versus blue, rather than Axis versus allies.
You know, extra credits, plenty of multiplayer video games already have this pretty down pat easy. Red versus blue on Halo, Team Fortress 2, purple versus green on Splatoon, where the fuck alignment is in Overwatch, etc. But the difference is, none of those games are based on real-world conflicts. The only game based on that conflict that doesn't depict the Nazis is Battlefield Heroes, and judging from how cartoonish the rest of the game is, it was most certainly designed for a mobile or PG focus in mind. As I said, it would be a huge disservice to the conflict of World War II if we're just essentially playing its corpse like it isn't what it is, but drape it in the aesthetic of the war.
A good example of a game that does this is Rainbow Six Siege. All of your bomb diffusion and hostage rescue multiplayer with no normalizing terrorists.
Well, that's a bit disingenuous, don't you think? For one, there is always an attacking and defending side, and secondly, bomb defusal and hostage rescue somehow doesn't normalize bomb defusal and hostage rescue by being the game as morally neutral? I mean, wouldn't playing as the terrorists, defending side, also mean that you are basically treating hostages and bombs as a minor inconvenience? Why is simply the label the only factor that normalizes anything?
In fact, by having all of the characters as counter-terrorists, training for a possible threat, it highlights how real and present of a threat that is.
What? Is this just selective inference or something? I wasn't aware that counter-terrorists train against each other with live hostages, live ammo, and real demolition equipment on each other in Rainbow Six Siege. Must have slept through that part of SWAT training or something. But more importantly, how exactly does that somehow make us more aware of the present threat by making all the enemies counter-terrorists, but not by making one side terrorists and counter-terrorists? Would that mean making both teams Nazi would work as sort of a double negative, making us realize the threat of Nazis as an ideology?
And if you decide that you need to have both sides be playable, don't make them interchangeable.
So the only way we could do this is if everyone who joined a server can't leave the server until the round ends, or that if someone does leave, well, too fucking bad. Also, how would this fix your previous issue of just merely being associated with Nazis, or not choosing to be the Nazis when you queue up a server?
Don't have players randomly spawn in as one or the other. Allow players to choose which side they're on. Now, of course, this has all sorts of in-game problems.
Finally, another concession from extra credits. I was a bit worried you were just going to make that statement without bringing up the thing I've been screaming about last 15 minutes or so. It's almost such an issue that you'd be better left not bothering and just have the confidence knowing that the people playing it can discern reality from fantasy.
Such as creating shorter wait times for fascists.
Wow. Holy fucking shit. That was seriously the only thing you could possibly think of as a serious issue for? Oh, and just to twist the knife too, that the only reason people would join the Nazis because they are a fascist, and not that they simply have no choice, being everyone migrated to one team and have no one to fight. Odd, isn't it? Wasn't extra credits previously saying that you didn't make a choice in choosing what team you're on, now suddenly deciding that joining the Nazis was a conscious choice to be one? Like I said, he gets to decide what you do is conscious.
But you know what? Those wait times could be artificially extended.
So, in order for people not having the shame of playing a real-world faction in a fictional game, we have to put everyone on one team, artificially bloat the wait times just to spite those playing the Nazis, and forever make teams be in balance. Yeah, sounds like a calculated sacrifice given the non-problem it solves.
If it meant players had an active choice in what teams they would represent, if you're saying we need people playing Nazis in our games.
Okay, I haven't brought it up before, but isn't team composition largely based on who you are playing with and not what flag decorates your team? Like, wouldn't that be another issue of making this whole everyone shouldn't be able to choose to play the Nazi side? Ironically, the Nazis would just join the Allied side and then act like Nazis normally, wouldn't they? And then what did you accomplish but wasting everyone else's time just to get at the Nazis' coattails? Yeah, real nice job with those 4 minutes of vendetta.
And if you're going to say, but we need it for historical reasons, then your game better actually be historical.
Then no World War II based game would ever be truly historical. And when people usually say for historical purposes, they usually mean just simply Nazis as a faction in said war. Because if we're being brutally honest, you wouldn't really want it to be historically accurate. You've already expressed much distress with even showing an actual swastika in this entire video. I don't think you'll be too happy to find that in spite of their vicious ideologies, the Nazis actually helped create a lot of advancements in their wake of genocide. No, I think you prefer your satirical Saturday morning cartoon villain rendition of Nazis and nothing else. No nuance or gray to middle the black and white waters of your worldview.
You can't really just hide behind the fact you called your desert map El Alamein and say, but it's historical.
Okay, so you went from way too general to way too specific. What he's talking about is the Battle of El Alamein during the Second World War, decisive battle for the Northern African campaign. Sure, any map depicting it can't really accurately express all the nuances of that particular conflict, but who's asking for absolute historical accuracy? There are some things we can give the benefit of a doubt in wartime video games, like guns never jamming, respawning, always perfect reloads, infinite sprint, but excluding a major enemy faction in a real-world conflict is where the facade peels away for most people playing a game based on real events. It's primarily why Battlefield 5 got so ridiculed for its historical revisionism, from no actual depictions of swastikas in the game, to physically handicapped people being conscripted into service, to loads of women being a major demographic in the war, when the opposite is true. And guess what the defense to that was? Ugh, you hate women! Gamers are so entitled! Just don't buy the game, you bigots! Also, have you ever went to El Alamein? What makes you a beacon of knowledge about the landscape of El Alamein?
If that were the case, you need your PvP to at least represent real historical events and be a realistic take on those battles.
Okay, so hypothetically, if I were to make a simulator where you get to play as a Nazi guard who has to escort Jewish refugees to their deaths in Auschwitz, you would be fine with that because it's historically accurate. Again, I just don't believe it coming from you, who is screeching at the very appearance of a swastika or people being queued up as a Nazi simply for team balance. What you're asking for would either make no more future World War II multiplayer games exist, or have every World War II conflict just have the Nazis omnipresent in spirit.
Once you make both sides balanced, it's also no longer historical. And you can't really say that you need Nazis anymore for historical accuracy.
What a fucking wormhole of doublethink. So because some aspects of history are curbed, it's okay to get rid of Nazis in a historical conflict, thus making it historically inaccurate. I mean, this is a fucking paradox of critical thinking if this is the justification you're going with. And, of course, they would balance the fucking teams. They wouldn't just let one team have a strictly better advantage unless said team had hackers on their team, or just simply better players in general. This isn't even a concession against the historically accurate basis. This is just simply a means to ensure that both teams are playing with the same tools.
Oh, and once you let players get cool weapons that weren't actually at that particular battleground, it's also no longer historically accurate.
Oh, you're still on this, huh? Yeah, I remember that some weapons designed for the Great War but never introduced into combat were put in Battlefield 1 anyway, but I wasn't completely put out of the experience as they seemed to fit the mold of combat. It was believable to me, but you know what wouldn't be believable? If some historical revisionist was so offended by the Austria-Hungary side and wanted them rid of in said major conflict. No one is privy to the idea that any game can accurately describe those major conflicts. No one is saying that. We simply want a believable amount of suspension of disbelief when it comes to playing them. Battlefield 5 is not the example to live by when it comes to historical revisionism.
And you can't declare that your game will suffer if you don't put players in the jackboots of the Third Reich.
You fucking moron. You just described a situation where the game would suffer if everyone has to be punished for possibly playing the Nazis. I have gone on countless ways this would hilariously backfire. Don't fucking tell me bold-faced this won't. Sure, you mean in the context of them existing as an entity in the war, but was anyone complaining about them to begin with? Was the biggest error of World War II games was that the Nazis existed as a faction that you might have to play as. Oh, how fucking spineless we've become that a fictional video game can somehow dictate to us what we believe and how we think if what you've even said was true.
And once your map is something carefully designed to have good gameplay by a team in a room in San Francisco or LA,
Really playing to your bases there, I'm sure. All those people who scare themselves to death at the idea of a neo-Nazi while they act like them in every turn.
and it's not a faithful reconstruction of the actual places the historical events occurred in, you can no longer say we need to have players take up arms in service of terror or hate.
Are we on the same base here? You do know we aren't literally gassing Jews in World War II via game console. And hey, if it's all or nothing with you, I'm sure you'll be fine with modern weapons, laser guns, dinosaurs, and midgets should be perfectly acceptable in your World War II game if we can't quite be laser point accurate to the history of it. This is similar in vein to the objectivity is a silly thing to strive for arguments by journalists who think that not being able to be a robot gives you license to be absolutely opinionated on every single subject.
And look, we're not saying we can't have games about World War II or about terrorism. We're not even saying we shouldn't make games where you play as a Nazi or a terrorist. But what we are saying is that the fact that you're playing as a Nazi or a terrorist in a game has to mean something.
No, it doesn't, especially if it comes to the duress of all the things you mentioned beforehand. More importantly, wouldn't that also require teams on the Allies and counter-terrorists to mean something more than just kill terrorists and kill Nazis? Does this also apply to any time you play as a terrorist or a Nazi in a single-player game? I mean, can a game just be fun for the sake of being fun first? Half the time I feel like the world's been flipped on its fucking head, where game companies are more concerned about trying to browbeat and harass their gamers with these ivory tower platitudes before making a decent experience, while still fleecing us of every dollar we have. Why EC has taken this fall this late and irrelevant in career is quite astounding to me.
And it can't just be a skin. It can't be something that a game randomly drops you into.
Repeating the same moot point that would require the gamers to be literally blind playing the games not to know that they might be the Nazis or whoever.
And really, if we are saying anything in this episode, it's this. Games can do better. And in this particular case, it's not even that hard to do better.
Yeah, the function of doing it is simple, but the result would be insurmountably bad gameplay experiences of 60 and 0 teams and arbitrarily long wait times despite those evil Nazis in real life.
And it's no more costly to do better. All it requires is that we in the game industry be cognizant of the world around us.
By turning off said world when it suits our convenience, and when there is something we want to be cognizant of, we can twist it as us teaching us of the hardships of said world we keep turning off to. And the rest is the general waffle about how the world is going to be a much better place if we censor those evil Nazis, or in EC's case, massively inconvenience everyone else's playtime despite some indescribable non-problem. Remember when Rust decided that the gender and race of the person you play in the game was completely random as a means to diversify the player base arbitrarily? It sank hard on sales because it tried to deal with some real-world non-issue in a fictional game by taking away any control the players have to make that choice for themselves. If this was implemented in any future World War II game, people would drop out mainly because of the moral grandstanding, but secondly because player queues would never be properly balanced. But why should I be surprised that EC would be perpetuating this kind of reasoning? It's the same formula with a new coat of paint of video games causes X, and like with all of them, they don't have a single shred of proof to back it up. Stop resurrecting outdated, bad arguments.